On March 16, 2026, a federal judge in New Jersey ordered the bailiffs to remove a Department of Justice lawyer from his courtroom. He told another lawyer from the government, "I don't believe you until you testify under oath." He said generations of assistant U.S. attorneys have built the goodwill of this office for your generation to destroy it within a year, and he ordered 3 people purporting to run the U.S. Attorney's Office to show up and testify under oath about who is actually in charge, which is pretty wild for a 22-minute hearing on a Monday morning in Trenton. But in reality, this was a culmination of a bunch of different fights that have been going on for a year now. One involves the leadership structure of U.S. attorneys' offices. That's our old pal Alina Habba. Another is over the Department of Homeland Security's insistence on detaining immigrants without a hearing, no matter how many federal judges say, no, that's illegal. And overlaying it all is a dispute about what the DOJ is for. Is it a tool of the president tasked with carrying out his political and personal agenda, or is it an independent prosecutorial entity dispensing blind justice regardless of race, creed, color, or political party? Those are important questions for all Americans, and Judge Zahid Qureshi is right in the middle of them. Judge Qureshi is no joke. He's a former JAG lawyer who served in the Army in Iraq and earned a Bronze Star and a Combat Action Badge. He was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. He was an assistant chief counsel for ICE, and he was a U.S. magistrate judge before being nominated by Joe Biden to the U.S. District Court for New Jersey in 2021. That is the resume of someone who has earned his stripes, literally, and if you come before him, you better come correct. But the government is not coming correct. Essentially, ICE's lawyers decided to yank a provision of the asylum statute out of context and pretend that any immigrant who doesn't have a green card must be detained indefinitely. The asylum statute does allow for people who show up at the border to be detained briefly so that they can appear before an immigration judge. But ICE wants to pretend that it applies to people who have been living and working legally in this country for decades, raising their families and paying their taxes and dutifully checking in with immigration officials. Since the Trump administration's mass deportation campaign began, federal courts have been flooded with habeas petitions. That's legal challenges filed by people who say they're being detained unlawfully. This is, of course, awful for the people who are being locked up, particularly because ICE has a nasty habit of releasing them thousands of miles from their homes and without their wallets or IDs. But the administrative burden is falling on already overworked judges as well as the prosecutors who have to deal with thousands of nearly identical habeas cases. Courts have almost uniformly rejected ICE's legal position. According to Reuters, more than 400 federal judges have issued over 4,400 rulings finding ICE detentions illegal. And one of those judges is Judge Qureshi. In February, he presided over a habeas petition filed by a Salvadoran woman who was found to have credible fear of returning to her home country and released by ICE in 2016 to live and work legally in the United States. In January of 2026, she was arrested and filed a habeas petition requesting to be released. On February 17th, Judge Qureshi ordered the government to conduct a bond hearing within 10 days and not to transfer this woman out of New Jersey. ICE transferred her to Oklahoma the day before the order issued, then to Texas the day the order issued, then back to Oklahoma 2 days after that. When Judge Qureshi asked the government to explain this 3-state shuffle, they argued that they weren't even obligated to bring her back to New Jersey. This is unfortunately not unusual. In fact, the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey admitted just 2 weeks earlier in a different case that the government had violated roughly 70 court orders in immigration habeas cases in New Jersey alone. And when it kept on happening, Judge Qureshi was livid. He said the government's continued actions after being called to task can now only be deemed intentional. The undersigned will not stand idly by and allow this intentional misconduct to go on. It ends today. Judge Qureshi said that the next habeas case, which comes in front of him, is going to involve sworn testimony by officials from the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. This is part of an ongoing rupture between the judiciary and the DOJ, a rupture that's been made much worse by the fact that for over a year now, nobody has been legally running the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of New Jersey. Now, in this age of rising authoritarianism, stories like this one go underreported, which is why independent media is more important than ever. So if you want to support us and our mission to demystify the law as independent creators, a great way to do it is by signing up for Nebula, the sponsor of this video. Nebula is a streaming service where you can watch all the content from your favorite creators like Jetlag, Maggie May Fish, Real Engineering, Philosophy Tube, Real Life Lore, and of course LegalEagle, ad-free and early. Plus, watch countless Nebula exclusives made with love, time, effort, and increased budgets that you won't find on YouTube. I highly recommend you check out Lindsay Ellis's original documentary, The Macabre World of Police Body Cam YouTube. It's a fascinating expose on how this wildly popular genre of true crime content is altering social attitudes about the law and policing. And check out our exclusive videos about how to abolish ICE, the wild and forgotten attempts to ban booze in America, and how RFK Jr. can legally ban vaccines. That was me on that one. But the only place you can watch these videos is on Nebula. In fact, every LegalEagle video we make is an extended cut on Nebula, like the legal analysis of improv comedy scenes Devin did with Brennan Lee Mulligan, or his beatdown of Kim Kardashian's hilariously bad legal drama All's Fair. Both of those contain a ton more insight and hilarious moments that we had to cut from the YouTube version. And if you use our link or code, you can get 50% off an annual subscription or 40% off a lifetime of Nebula. Either way, click or scan now to continue watching LegalEagle on Nebula, or we will see you in court. On March 5th, 2025, President Trump nominated New Jersey lawyer John Giordano to lead the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Garden State. Giordano had a pretty normal resume for the job. He's a former federal prosecutor with significant experience in both state and federal government, but it was not meant to be. Less than 3 weeks later, Trump packed Giordano off to Namibia to make room for his personal lawyer, Alina Habba. This was not what you might call a strategic move, and not just because Habba had never been a federal prosecutor and was dramatically unqualified to run this 170-lawyer office. The Constitution says that U.S. attorneys shall be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But under the Senate's blue slip rule, nominees for district court judge and U.S. attorney don't get a vote without the buy-in from both home state senators. New Jersey's two Democratic senators, Cory Booker and Andy Kim, were never going to give their blessing to Alina Habba, so that nomination was DOA. But Trump wanted her there, just like he wanted serial texter Lindsay Halligan in the Eastern District of Virginia. So he told Attorney General Pam Bondi to make it happen, and she tried her best, relying on a bunch of different federal statutes, which we broke down in this fun video. A bunch of criminal defendants immediately moved to get their cases dismissed on the theory that Habba wasn't legally serving, and thus anything that came out of her office was null and void. And in August of 2025, Judge Matthew Brand ruled that they were half right. None of Bondi's workarounds to avoid the necessity for Senate confirmation was legal, and Habba was not the lawfully serving U.S. attorney for New Jersey. But Judge Brand ruled that the assistant U.S. attorneys, AUSAs, were working under a delegation of power from AG Bondi, so their filings were fine even if Habba wasn't. So the criminal defendants were still on the hook. Courts in at least 6 other states have come to the exact same conclusion, although many of Trump's nominees still hung around, calling themselves the first assistant U.S. attorney or some such. As for Habba, she insisted for another 4 months that she was, too, the U.S. attorney until December, when the Third Circuit said, no, seriously, you definitely aren't that, at which point she flounced off in a huff, saying, you can take the girl out of New Jersey, but you can't take the New Jersey out of the girl, which is funny because she supposedly picked up her kids and moved to Florida so as to be closer to Trump's political operation at Mar-a-Lago. In Judge Brand's opinion, he said that the Attorney General can't appoint a special counsel and delegate to her all the powers of a U.S. attorney, which makes sense, right? Because that would basically zero out the advise and consent role for the Senate. But in a footnote, he said he wasn't going to decide right then and there whether the AG could divide the responsibilities of a U.S. attorney between multiple different people, because that issue wasn't before him. And in an act of maximum trolling, Pam Bondi said, cool, we'll do that then. On December 8th, 2025, the same day Habba resigned, Bondi appointed 3 people to collectively run the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. Philip Lamparello as senior counsel overseeing the criminal division, Jordan Fox as special attorney overseeing civil and appellate, and Ari Fontecchio as executive assistant U.S. attorney overseeing administration. The theory was that since no single person was doing the full job of U.S. attorney, nobody had been appointed in a way that required Senate confirmation. The government's own internal memo described the arrangement as designed to divide the responsibilities of the U.S. attorney among 3 officials. But then the same defendants trooped back to Judge Brand and said, hey, if Bondi can't give the job to 1 person without Senate confirmation, she can't give it to 3 people either, right? And the answer to that one was no, obviously she can't do that. And Judge Brand ruled that what he called the triumvirate was also illegal because Fox, Fontecchio, and Lamparello were jointly exercising the powers of a U.S. attorney, which requires presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. But this time, he said maybe defendants do get their cases dismissed. It's a bit complicated, but essentially the court said, because you, Pam Bondi, came up with this goofy three-headed leadership structure, I was forced to get really deep in the weeds and think about the issue from a different angle. And while I said the first time around that the line prosecutors were acting under a delegation of authority from the Attorney General, I now realize that they're being funded from this pot of money designated by Congress to support U.S. attorneys. And since that money is not coming out of general DOJ funds, I may have to rethink this question of whether these prosecutions survive when the U.S. attorney is serving illegally. So Judge Brand ordered more briefing on that issue, and he also stayed his order disqualifying the triumvirate to give the government time to appeal. But he ended that order with a warning that said a stay cannot validate an unlawful appointment. If the government chooses to leave the triumvirate in place, it does so at its own risk. And to be clear, the risk is that if Judge Brand eventually rules that this funding structure infects everything, then every case the triumvirate supervises may get dismissed. So that was March 9th. The very next day, Judge Qureshi issued a text order in a pending criminal case suggesting that the government should really postpone this sentencing hearing scheduled for March 16th to give everyone time to digest the importance of Judge Brand's ruling. But he said if the DOJ chooses to go ahead, the assigned assistant U.S. attorney, or AUSA, shall be prepared to address questions from the court as to the current structure of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of New Jersey, the legal authority for the AUSA's appearance, the AUSA's personal knowledge of the content of the 130-page opinion by Judge Brand, the legal sufficiency of a waiver if defendant agrees to proceed despite these circumstances, and any additional inquiry the court deems appropriate. But the government said, thanks, but no thanks. In a 5-sentence response, the line assistant U.S. attorney, Daniel Rosenblum, said that the government needed to go ahead because this is a victim case, but that he would be prepared to answer all the court's questions. That was a very bad idea. Now, we already said that Judge Qureshi's pissed about all those habeas petitions, and he's pissed because the DOJ's leadership structure is a mess, and that's why he said, you guys should definitely postpone, only to get blown off by the DOJ. But in this case specifically, he's pissed because the government messed up really bad. What happened is they gave this defendant, Francisco Villafane, a deal last April to allow him to plead guilty to 1 count each of possession and receipt of child sex abuse materials, or CSAM. But at that point, the FBI was still reviewing the contents of Villafane's phone. In October, the government came back to the court and said the FBI had found 116 additional series of CSAM on the phone. And we can't see the sentencing report on the public docket, but from the descriptions of it in court, those images were horrific. So there's all this other terrible stuff on Villafane's phone, and the prosecutors had already inked the deal with him, which meant they could not charge him for any of it. So Judge Qureshi is furious that they screwed this case up, and he's even more furious that they claimed they couldn't postpone the hearing because of all of the victims they just completely let down due to their own incompetence. Okay, so at 11 a.m., this case is gavelled in. Rosenblum announces his appearance, and then his supervisor, AUSA Mark Coyne, stands up and says that he will also be appearing for the United States, which is really not normal. Because if you are an attorney appearing in a case, you have to enter your appearance on the public docket because you're effectively putting yourself on the line and claiming responsibility for it. So the court could have let it slide and let Coyne enter his appearance verbally, but did I mention Judge Qureshi is already big mad? So he said, are you here for moral support? Because you're not going to speak. He said basically, your supervisee, Daniel Rosenblum, said in his email that he was perfectly capable of answering my questions without your help, and you let him do it, so nope, I'm not going to hear from you, Mr. Coyne. If you want to sit there for moral support or hand Mr. Rosenblum Post-its or whisper in his ear, I will let you do that as his supervisor. And Coyne agreed that he would just sit there and keep quiet. So first, the judge beat up Rosenblum for dropping the ball on this horrible case. He said, how did this screw up happen? Was it your office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, or both? Or how did you execute a plea agreement without knowing all the evidence on the device, only to later to find out, oh my God, there's babies and prepubescent children and bestiality? And look, I think it's fair to infer that Judge Qureshi believes that the DOJ was using these minor victims as an excuse not to postpone the hearing, when the real reason was actually political. That is, by accepting that they should postpone the hearing in light of Judge Brand's order, the government would be tacitly acknowledging that Judge Brand might be right that the triumvirate is illegal and nothing that comes out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey is legitimate. And so instead they said, well, we have to go forward because of these children, which is pretty crass when you let these children down already thanks to your own negligence, particularly since holding the hearing in April rather than in March wasn't going to change anything for those victims, which is why Qureshi said there's many victims in this case, none of which seem to be of concern to your office, but now to proceed today, it is. And then he started asking these very pointed questions about the triumvirate leadership of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. And remember, this is an office Judge Qureshi worked in himself, so he definitely knows how it's supposed to go. He starts off by asking Rosenblum how long he's been at the office, which is about 2.5 years. Rosenblum is clearly low man on the totem pole, and surprise, surprise, he does not have any personal knowledge of how the people in charge are running it. He knows what his supervisors have told him, but he's never interacted with Jordan Fox or Ari Fontecchio or Phil Lamparello, so he cannot possibly answer the court's questions about how this office is being run and why they're so sure that they have legal authority to continue prosecuting cases. And then the judge asks Rosenblum if he has personal knowledge as to whether Ms. Haba is operating your office currently today in any capacity. At which point Coyne, who has managed to sit on his hands the whole time, jumps in and says she's not, and the judge says, sit down, Mr. Coyne. If you speak again, I'm going to have you removed. And then when Coyne continues to object, the judge directs the security officers to remove him, which is wild. Judges have always given federal prosecutors enormous deference. Most judges, like Judge Qureshi, have been federal prosecutors themselves. And that deference is gone. Gone to the point that a federal judge is directing the bailiffs to pick up this assistant U.S. attorney and eject him like an unruly patron at a bar. So obviously, Rosenblum is in no position to answer the court's questions once his supervisor is gone. All he can do is kind of mumble about Judge Brand staying his order, at which point Judge Qureshi said, read me the last line of Judge Brand's opinion again. That's the one where Judge Brand said, if the government chooses to leave the triumvirate in place, it does so at its own risk. And then Judge Qureshi spelled it out. He said, here is your risk. This is your risk. The risk is that you refuse to back down and put a competent prosecutor in charge of this office, and it blows up in your face because it turns out that nothing the triumvirate touches is legally valid. They already let these poor kids, the victims in this case, down, and now, because the DOJ refuses to back down, there's a chance this defendant walks away entirely. That is the risk. That's why Judge Qureshi was so angry. Judge Qureshi let Daniel Rosenblum have it in that hearing with both barrels, but he was not totally unsympathetic to the lawyer's position. He said, it is not my custom to shoot the messenger. I threw you this lifeline and you did not accept it, and they left you here, okay? They left you here by yourself. Nobody filed a notice of appearance to stand next to you. Mr. Coyne didn't file a notice of appearance to stand next to you. And the judge is right. Rosenblum got hung out to dry by Coyne and everybody else in that office who let him walk into the buzzsaw knowing that he couldn't possibly answer those questions. The fact that Coyne wandered in at the last second doesn't really change that. That's a total failure of leadership, which is pretty clearly a byproduct of the chaos in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, and in fact, in the DOJ writ large. Part of why federal judges are so furious at the Justice Department is that the quality of work has declined so precipitously. And that's partly because political appointees have pushed out a lot of competent people who served in leadership and provided generational continuity. And partly because it's impossible to hire and retain good people when you're asking them to do bad, unethical things. So we've talked a lot about Minnesota, where there's been all those habeas cases and lawyers being parachuted in from immigration court or the JAG Corps to represent the government. That's because the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota has half as many lawyers as it did 2 years ago. And the senior leadership resigned after the murder of Renee Good when Pam Bondi's office told them to investigate Good's widow rather than the ICE agent who shot this woman. And look, Rosenblum isn't a bad lawyer. In fact, He's exactly the kind of lawyer who you would expect to encounter in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He went to an Ivy League law school. He clerked for a federal district court judge and then a circuit court judge. He spent several years at a very fancy law firm in New York, and then he took probably a 70% pay cut to go work for the U.S. Attorney's Office because in 2023, that was still an incredibly prestigious gig. And now, 3 years later, they literally can't fill those jobs. In January, the DOJ's chief of staff, Chad Mizell, posted on social media asking lawyers who support President Trump and his anti-crime agenda to DM him directly. No posting, no process, just slide into the chief of staff's DMs if you're a Trump supporter who wants to be a federal prosecutor. And he's not the only one. Ari Fontecchio and Phil Lamparello are doing the same thing in New Jersey, as is Jordan Fox. And look, I'm sure all three of them are really good lawyers. But Lamparello is supposed to be running the criminal section, and he's a commercial litigator who never prosecuted a federal criminal case in his life. Jordan Fox graduated law school in 2021, and her most recent gig was as chief of staff to Deputy AG Todd Blanche. She's never prosecuted a case either, and she's the supervisor for Daniel Rosenblum, who, by the way, graduated law school in 2015. Recruitment has gotten so bad that the DOJ has quietly suspended its longstanding requirement that new AUSAs have to have at least 1 year of legal experience. The department sent out a memo to all U.S. attorneys' offices on March 13th titled Suspension of Attorney 1 Year Experience Requirement, informing them that they could now hire prosecutors straight out of law school. A DOJ spokesman celebrated this as empowering young and passionate prosecutors. At Liberty University School of Law, the Career Services Office sent students an email describing an internship pipeline into federal agencies. The two most important requirements were that applicants must be aligned politically with President Trump and his administration and be willing to work hard. Quote, GPA is not a strong factor. That is how you wind up with Judge Qureshi saying, I don't believe you. You have lost the confidence and the trust of this court. You've lost the confidence and trust of the New Jersey legal community, and you are losing the trust and confidence of the public. This is what has happened to the credibility of your office. Generations of assistant U.S. attorneys had built the goodwill of that office for your generation to destroy it within a year. And so Villafane wasn't sentenced on March 16th. Instead, Judge Qureshi rescheduled the hearing for April 1 and ordered Fontecchio, Lamparello, and Fox to show up and answer his questions under oath. But then a funny thing happened. Once it became clear that they weren't going to be able to just brazen through this by putting some line attorney through the judicial wood chipper, the government decided it really wasn't so hot to get this hearing over with after all. After finally managing to enter his appearance, Mark Coyne submitted a letter requesting that 30-day postponement that Judge Qureshi had offered in the first place. Looks like the triumvirate isn't so excited to get on the witness stand and explain themselves. You know the saying, personnel is policy? Well, if you doggedly insist on downgrading your personnel, you run the risk of winding up with no policy at all.
Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems, and they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.